The rain poured relentlessly that evening, washing the dust off the narrow streets of a forgotten town. Inside a small, dimly lit room, a young man named Ethan sat hunched over his desk, staring blankly at a rejection letter. It was his 12th one that month. His trembling hands held the paper as though it were a piece of evidence confirming what he feared most, that he simply wasn't good enough. He had dreamed of becoming an architect since childhood, fascinated by the idea of creating something lasting, something beautiful. But each interview ended the same way: polite smiles, empty promises, and the slow decay of hope. The rejections weren't just about losing jobs anymore. They were chipping away at his self-worth, one letter at a time. That night, Ethan felt something inside him snap. He tore all his sketches, his blueprints, and the designs he'd spent years perfecting. The floor became a graveyard of paper dreams. For hours, he sat in silence, watching the rain hit the window, the sound echoing like a heartbeat that refused to stop no matter how broken he felt inside. When morning came, Ethan packed a small bag and left the city. He walked until the skyscrapers turned into trees, and the noise became wind. He ended up in a remote village, exhausted, defeated, and with no plan other than to disappear. An old carpenter found him sitting near the bus stop, drenched and shivering. "You look lost," the old man said, offering him a warm cup of tea. Ethan didn't respond. He just stared into the steaming cup as though trying to find answers in the ripples. The carpenter's name was Samuel. He ran a small workshop where he built wooden furniture by hand. He offered Ethan a place to stay in exchange for helping around the workshop. Ethan agreed, though he barely spoke for days. At first, Ethan just swept floors and carried wood. But he watched Samuel work, how the old man treated every piece of timber like it was alive, shaping it patiently, never rushing, never complaining. There was a strange peace in the way he moved. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Samuel noticed Ethan sketching something in the corner of a worn notebook. "What's that you're drawing?" he asked. "Nothing," Ethan muttered. But Samuel persisted, and soon Ethan showed him a small wooden bridge connecting two hills. The design was simple yet elegant. Samuel's eyes softened. "Why don't you build it?" Ethan hesitated. "I can't. I'm not good enough. I failed too many times." The old man smiled. "Failure only means you tried before you learned how to succeed." The next morning, Samuel handed Ethan a set of tools and told him to start. At first, Ethan's hands shook with every cut. The wood splintered, the angles didn't fit, and frustration consumed him. He wanted to quit again. But every time he looked at Samuel, the old man was smiling, sanding a chair, humming a tune that seemed to whisper, "Keep going." Weeks passed. Slowly, Ethan learned the rhythm of the craft, the patience of shaping something from nothing. His design began to rise piece by piece, like hope rebuilding itself after a storm. He learned to trust his instincts again, to find beauty in mistakes, to start over without fear. The day the bridge was completed, the entire village came to see it. It wasn't perfect, but it stood strong, steady, and beautiful in its own raw way. When Ethan walked across it, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. Not the kind that comes from praise, but the quiet kind that grows from persistence. Samuel clapped him on the back. "You see, my boy," he said softly, "success doesn't come to those who never fail. It comes to those who refuse to stop trying." That night, under the starry sky, Ethan sat by the bridge alone, the wind brushing through his hair. He thought of all the rejection letters, the nights of doubt, the moments he almost gave up. But now, he understood, they weren't failures. They were lessons, each one shaping him into someone stronger. He decided to return to the city, not to chase success this time, but to create it himself. With Samuel's blessing, Ethan gathered his sketches once more, this time with renewed fire in his eyes. Months later, Ethan's small architecture firm began to grow. His designs carried the soul of that wooden bridge. Simple, strong, meaningful. People loved his work not because it was flawless, but because it was human. Each creation told a story of struggle, growth, and resilience. But Ethan never forgot where it all began. In a small village, with an old carpenter who taught him that sometimes, when the world breaks you, it's only so you can rebuild yourself stronger than before. And one day, as he stood before a towering glass building he designed, a structure that symbolized perseverance. He smiled, remembering Samuel's words echoing in his heart like a timeless truth. Failure isn't the opposite of success. It's the foundation of it. He closed his eyes, feeling the wind brush his face again, whispering the same rhythm he'd once heard in that wooden workshop, the rhythm of resilience, of starting over, of never giving up. Because sometimes you have to lose everything to find who you truly are. Ethan smiled quietly, his eyes reflecting both pain and pride. And just as the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the city in gold, he whispered to himself, "This is just the beginning." The morning light spilled through the wide glass windows of Ethan's new studio, painting streaks of gold across the polished wooden floor. The city outside buzzed with motion. Cars, people, dreams all moving at once. But inside, there was a quiet sense of focus, an energy that pulsed like a heartbeat. Ethan stood at his desk, surrounded by sketches, models, and sheets of crumpled paper. His hands were stained with pencil graphite, and his eyes burned with both exhaustion and purpose. He had taken on a project that everyone said was impossible, rebuilding an old, abandoned orphanage that had once housed hundreds of children. The structure was decaying, the foundation unstable, and investors weren't willing to fund it. But Ethan saw something others didn't. He saw beauty where others saw ruin. He saw potential where others saw loss. Every morning, he returned to that place, a ghost of the past, with walls cracked and covered in ivy, windows shattered like forgotten memories. He'd walk through the empty halls, hearing faint echoes of laughter that once filled the space. There was something haunting yet inspiring about it. And every time he looked up at the broken roof, he whispered to himself, "I can bring you back." The work was grueling. The budget was tight. The challenges were endless. Blueprints had to be revised again and again, and the deadlines felt like mountains pressing against his chest. There were nights when he didn't sleep, when his body begged him to stop. But the thought of giving up never came again. Because this time, Ethan understood that every failure, every obstacle, was a step forward, not backward. Months went by. Rain fell, seasons changed, and slowly, the orphanage began to transform. The walls were rebuilt, the windows restored, the air once heavy with silence now filled with the hum of workers, laughter, and hope. Children from the nearby neighborhood began visiting, watching curiously as Ethan and his team brought the building back to life. One day, as Ethan reviewed the progress, a little girl approached him. Her clothes were old, and her eyes carried a sadness far too deep for her age. "Mister," she asked softly, "will kids like me be able to live here again?" Ethan knelt beside her, looking into her hopeful eyes. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly why I'm building it." The girl smiled, a small, fragile smile, and ran off. Ethan stood up, feeling something stir inside him. It wasn't pride. It was purpose. He realized that true success wasn't about fame, money, or recognition. It was about making something that outlived you, something that gave others a reason to hope. As the project neared completion, the day finally came when Ethan received an unexpected letter. It was from the National Architectural Board. His design for the orphanage had been nominated for an International Humanitarian Award, recognition for creativity that not only inspired but changed lives. Ethan stared at the letter in disbelief. The same hands that once held rejection after rejection were now holding proof that perseverance had rewritten his story. When the ceremony arrived, Ethan stood on stage under the bright lights, surrounded by applause. But as he looked out at the crowd, reporters, investors, officials, his thoughts drifted back to the small village, to the smell of wood and the sound of Samuel's calm voice. He could almost see the old man smiling in the distance, nodding in quiet approval. After the event, Ethan visited Samuel's village again. The bridge they had built together still stood strong, though the wood had aged and the vines had crept up its sides. He crossed it slowly, memories flooding his mind with every step, the first cut of wood, the trembling of failure, the steady rhythm of rebuilding. Samuel's workshop was empty now. The tools were neatly arranged, as though waiting for their owner to return. On the dusty table lay a note, faded by time. It was written in Samuel's familiar handwriting. "When you build something with love, it never dies. It simply takes a new form." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of those words sink deep into his heart. He smiled, whispering, "Thank you, old man. You were right all along." When he returned to the city, the orphanage was ready to open. On that day, dozens of children filled the building with laughter, their voices echoing through the halls like a song of rebirth. The walls that once knew silence now carried life again. Ethan stood by the entrance, watching them run and play. His eyes shimmered with emotion as he saw the same little girl who once asked him that question now twirling joyfully under the sunlight. She ran up to him and handed him a small wooden carving, a tiny bridge. "My grandpa taught me to make this," she said shyly. "I wanted you to have it." Ethan took it in his hand, unable to speak. The carving was rough, imperfect, yet beautiful, a symbol of everything he had learned. He smiled and placed it on his desk later that night, right beside his first blueprint, the one he had once crumpled in despair. Years later, when Ethan's name became known across the world, people often asked him the same question, "What's your secret to success?" He always gave the same answer. "I failed more times than I succeeded. But each failure taught me something success never could. It taught me patience, humility, and the courage to start again." He would pause, looking at the wooden bridge still resting on his desk, and add softly, "And I met a man who showed me that the greatest things we build are not made of wood or stone, but of resilience." As the years passed, Ethan began mentoring young architects, teaching them not just how to design, but how to endure. He told them that every masterpiece begins with a mistake, and every success story begins with a failure that refused to stay down. And though time moved on, every time it rained, every time he heard the soft rhythm of drops against glass, Ethan would look out at the city and remember that night long ago, when he almost gave up, and how, in that very moment of breaking, his journey had truly begun. Years flowed quietly, and the city Ethan once viewed as cold and unforgiving had turned into a canvas painted with his creations. Every building he designed carried a story, a heartbeat hidden beneath concrete and glass. But no matter how far he rose, Ethan remained grounded, humbled by the road that had shaped him. He had learned that success wasn't a destination but a lifelong rhythm of falling, learning, and rising again. One chilly evening, he sat alone in his office overlooking the skyline. The golden lights flickered across the city like scattered stars, and in their reflection, Ethan saw pieces of his younger self, the boy who once sat in a dark room with torn sketches and trembling hands. A knock on the door broke his reverie. His assistant, Clara, stepped in, holding a portfolio. "Sir, there's a young architect who requested your mentorship," she said. "He's very persistent. Been waiting since morning." Ethan raised an eyebrow but smiled faintly. "Persistent, huh? Let him in." A few moments later, a nervous young man entered. He couldn't have been older than 22, clutching his sketchbook as if it were his last hope. "Mr. Ethan, I've followed your work for years," he began, voice trembling. "But I keep failing. Every design I submit gets rejected. I'm starting to think maybe I'm not meant for this." Ethan looked at him quietly for a moment, and then gestured toward the window. "Do you see that tall building out there?" The young man nodded. "I designed it after being rejected 17 times, Ethan said. "And the one beside it?" "After 24. You see, the world will test you again and again, not to break you, but to see if you're truly ready for what's meant for you." The boy's eyes widened, and his shoulders straightened slightly. "So, you think I should keep trying?" Ethan smiled softly. "I don't think. I know. You'll never regret persistence. You'll only regret quitting." When the young man left, Ethan leaned back in his chair, feeling an unexpected warmth inside. He realized that mentoring others was more than guidance. It was his way of honoring Samuel, the old carpenter who had once done the same for him. The cycle of resilience was continuing, passing quietly from one soul to another. Weeks later, Ethan was invited to speak at a global conference on architecture and innovation. Thousands gathered in the grand hall as he took the stage. Cameras flashed, applause echoed, but Ethan didn't feel the rush of fame anymore. What he felt was gratitude. He began his speech not with technical terms or design theories, but with a story. "Years ago," he said, his voice calm yet powerful, "I sat in a small room surrounded by broken dreams. I thought failure was my enemy. I thought rejection meant I wasn't good enough. But time taught me something different. Failure is not a wall. It's a door. Most people just never push hard enough to open it. The hall fell silent, hanging on to his every word. Success, he continued, isn't about never falling. It's about building the strength to stand up again and again, until your scars become your strength. When the speech ended, people rose to their feet in a standing ovation. But as Ethan stepped off the stage, he wasn't thinking of applause. He was thinking of that first night of rain, of Samuel's workshop, and the bridge that changed everything. Later that evening, he found himself walking along the riverbank, where the city lights danced upon the water. He stopped near an old bench and sat down. The cool air carried the faint scent of wood and earth, a memory so vivid that for a moment, he almost felt Samuel sitting beside him again. "Did I make you proud?" Ethan whispered to the night. The breeze rustled through the trees as if answering him. A small smile touched his lips. He knew that Samuel's lessons weren't just in his mind, they were in every structure he built, every person he inspired, every life his work touched. A few days later, Ethan received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was handwritten, simple, and carried no return address. Inside was a photograph of the bridge he'd built with Samuel, now beautifully restored by the villagers. Beneath it were words written in a familiar tone. "The bridge still stands. And so does your legacy." Ethan held the letter to his chest, eyes glistening. He realized that the bridge wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol. A connection between the man he used to be and the man he had become. Between despair and hope. Between failure and success. Years passed, and Ethan's company grew into one of the most respected architectural firms in the world. Yet he kept his life simple. He still sketched on paper instead of digital screens. He still kept the little wooden bridge on his desk. And he still visited the orphanage every year, sitting with the children, listening to their laughter echo through the halls he once rebuilt from ruins. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the skyline, Ethan stood on the rooftop of his latest project, a community center built entirely from sustainable materials. Around him, his young team worked with the same hunger he once had. Clara approached him and asked softly, "What drives you to keep going, even now?" Ethan looked at the horizon, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of dusk. "Because every time I create something," he said, "I remember what it felt like to be broken. And I want to show people that even broken things can build beautiful worlds." He turned toward his team and smiled, feeling that same steady rhythm of life he'd once heard in the old workshop, the rhythm of creation, of purpose, of endless beginnings. That night, as he left the site, a light rain began to fall. Ethan looked up at the sky, letting the drops touch his face. The sound was soft, familiar, like a whisper from the past. He closed his eyes, and in that moment, the rain didn't feel cold. It felt like home. The world around him blurred into motion. Cars, lights, footsteps, but inside him, there was peace. Because he knew now, more than ever, that success was never about reaching the top. It was about never losing the courage to climb again. The rain softened into a mist as Ethan walked down the quiet street, his footsteps echoing against the wet pavement. The air smelled of earth and memory, the kind of scent that reminded him of every beginning he had ever known. He moved slowly, unhurried, lost in thoughts that stretched between past and present. Across the street, a small bookstore caught his eye. It wasn't one he remembered seeing before, though he must have passed this way many times. The wooden sign above the door read, "Chapters of Time." Something about the name drew him in. When he stepped inside, a tiny bell rang above the door, and the warmth wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. Books lined the shelves from floor to ceiling, their spines worn and edges frayed. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes. She looked up, her smile soft and knowing. "You look like a man searching for something," she said gently. Ethan chuckled. "Aren't we all?" She nodded and pointed toward a corner where an old chest sat beneath a reading lamp. "Sometimes what we seek finds us first," she murmured. Ethan walked over, curiosity tugging at him. The chest was filled with journals, handwritten pages, sketches, notes from people he'd never met. He opened one at random and began reading. Each page told a story of struggle, of dreams chased and lost and found again. There were letters from artists, builders, teachers, mothers, people who had fought through failure and emerged with something stronger than victory: resilience. He turned another page and froze. The handwriting was oddly familiar, slanted, firm, and deliberate. His heart tightened when he saw the name signed at the bottom. Samuel. It was a short entry, no more than a paragraph. One day, a young man will come to understand that failure isn't the end, it's a teacher. When he does, he'll build something that lasts longer than either of us. I hope he reads this when the time is right. Ethan's throat tightened. He read the words again, slowly, tracing the lines with his fingers as though touching the past itself. He wondered how this journal ended up here, but somehow, he knew the answer didn't matter. Life had a way of circling back, connecting hearts across time in quiet, mysterious ways. He closed the book and stood there for a moment, the rain tapping gently against the windows. When he looked up, the old woman was watching him, her expression unreadable yet deeply compassionate. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we are led to reminders so we never forget where we came from." Ethan nodded slowly, unable to find words. He thanked her, purchased the journal, and stepped back into the cool night. The city lights shimmered through the mist, blurring into golden streaks as though the world itself was painting over his memories with gentle strokes. That night, he placed Samuel's journal beside the wooden bridge on his desk. Together, they looked like two fragments of the same soul, past and present coexisting quietly. He sat down and began writing in his own journal, the pages crisp and white, waiting to be filled. He wrote not about buildings or awards, but about the moments that shaped him, the nights of doubt, the lessons of patience, the kindness that saved him when he had nothing left to give. He wrote about the bridge, the orphanage, the children, the young architect who reminded him of himself. And as the ink spread across the paper, he realized that stories were the true architecture of life. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's company launched a new initiative, Project Rebuild. It aimed to restore old structures across neglected parts of the country, transforming forgotten ruins into schools, shelters, and art spaces. Instead of chasing corporate contracts, he poured his energy into this mission. The media called it revolutionary, but Ethan didn't care for the headlines. He cared about the lives that would be changed, the hope that would rise from broken bricks. One afternoon, while inspecting a project site in a small coastal town, Ethan met a young woman sketching the remains of an ancient lighthouse. She had the same intensity in her eyes he once had, the spark of someone who dreamed despite doubt. "Are you one of the volunteers?" he asked, stepping beside her. She looked up and smiled. "Not exactly. I'm an artist. I paint places that people forget." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe we're doing the same thing," he said. "You paint forgotten places. I rebuild them." She laughed softly. "Maybe both of us are just trying to remind the world that beauty never really disappears, it just waits to be seen again." Those words stayed with Ethan. That night, as he stood by the half-rebuilt lighthouse, he watched the waves crash against the shore, fierce yet rhythmic. He felt the same force within himself, a current that never stopped moving, no matter how many times it broke against the rocks. When the lighthouse was finally completed months later, it became more than a structure, it became a beacon of perseverance. People from nearby towns began visiting, not just to admire the view but to feel the spirit of revival it carried. At the opening ceremony, Ethan stood silently among the crowd, letting the sound of the waves fill his heart. As night fell, the light at the top flickered on, casting its glow across the dark ocean. It illuminated everything, the sky, the sea, and the countless unseen journeys still unfolding somewhere beyond the horizon. Ethan felt the same warmth rise within him that he once felt while building that first wooden bridge. Life, he realized, was not about conquering mountains but crossing bridges, between who we were and who we become, between despair and faith, between endings and new beginnings. He turned to leave, but before he did, he looked back one last time at the glowing tower and whispered softly, "Thank you, Samuel." The wind carried his words out to sea, lost in the endless rhythm of waves and stars. Back in the city, his days were filled with movement again. Meetings, designs, travels, but inside, Ethan remained calm, grounded. He had reached a place beyond ambition, beyond the need for validation. He had learned to build not just with his hands, but with his heart. And whenever he passed by that wooden bridge or flipped through Samuel's journal, he was reminded that everything he had become, every success he had achieved, was born from the simple courage to keep going when everything seemed lost. The world would call it greatness. Ethan knew it was something deeper, grace found through struggle, purpose born through pain, and the quiet beauty of never giving up. The years continued to unfold quietly, each one leaving behind invisible fingerprints on Ethan's life. The skyline he once admired as an outsider now stood as living proof of his journey. Yet, for all his accomplishments, Ethan never let pride harden him. He had learned that real strength didn't roar, it whispered. It existed in the quiet moments, in the unseen battles, in the persistence to rise again after every fall. One winter morning, the city lay beneath a blanket of snow, and Ethan found himself drawn back to the orphanage. It had been years since its restoration, and now it was alive with laughter and color. The children were decorating for the holidays, stringing paper stars and garlands across the halls. As soon as they saw him, they ran to greet him, their faces bright with joy. "Mr. Ethan! Look!" one boy shouted, pointing to a small wooden model on a table. It was a miniature version of the orphanage, crafted with surprising detail. Ethan knelt to admire it. "Did you make this?" The boy nodded proudly. "We all did. Miss Clara helped us. She said you'd like it." Ethan smiled, touched deeply. "It's perfect," he said softly. Clara appeared from the next room, carrying a tray of cocoa. "You always said architecture begins with imagination," she teased. "Looks like they've been taking that seriously." Ethan chuckled, taking a mug. "Then the future is in good hands." They stood for a while, watching the children play. A warmth filled Ethan's chest, not the kind born from success, but from knowing he had planted something that would outlive him. A seed of belief. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Ethan wandered outside. The snow crunched beneath his boots, and the air shimmered with quiet stillness. He walked toward the small garden at the back of the orphanage, where a plaque stood under an old oak tree. In memory of Samuel, who taught that failure is not the end, but the beginning of wisdom. Ethan brushed off the snow from the plaque, his breath forming clouds in the cold night air. "You were right," he whispered. "You always were." For a long moment, he just stood there, listening to the faint sound of wind weaving through the trees. He realized that success, no matter how grand, was temporary. But the lessons we give, the kindness we leave behind, those are eternal. The next day, Ethan returned to his studio and found a letter waiting on his desk. It was an invitation from an international university. They wanted him to speak at a graduation ceremony, to share his story with students about resilience and purpose. He accepted without hesitation. Weeks later, standing before a sea of young faces filled with ambition and uncertainty, Ethan began not with achievements, but with vulnerability. "When I was your age," he said, "I believed success meant winning. But I was wrong. Success is not about avoiding failure. It's about allowing failure to shape you." He spoke of rejection, of despair, of the night he almost gave up. He told them about the old carpenter who believed in him when no one else did, and the bridge that changed his life. The auditorium was silent except for his voice, steady, calm, and honest. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. But more powerful than the applause were the faces, some tearful, some smiling, of those who had found hope in his words. He realized then that sharing his scars had become a way of healing others. After the ceremony, a young woman approached him. Her voice trembled as she said, "Sir, I was going to quit architecture. I thought I didn't have what it takes. But hearing you today, I'm going to try again." Ethan smiled gently. "Good," he said. "Because trying again is where success begins." On the flight home, as clouds drifted beneath the wings, Ethan stared out the window and thought about the countless people who carried unseen burdens, the ones who smiled on the outside while fighting storms within. He wished he could tell them all that it was okay to stumble, to break, to begin again. That failure wasn't a sign of weakness, it was proof of courage. When he landed, he was greeted by messages from his team about new projects and collaborations. But one message caught his attention. It was from the same young architect he had mentored years ago, the one who had once come to him on the brink of giving up. The message read, "I've just been hired for my first major project. Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Ethan's heart swelled with quiet pride. He replied simply, "You earned it. Keep building." That evening, he visited his studio alone. The city lights flickered outside, painting reflections across the glass walls. He poured himself a cup of tea and sat by his desk, where the wooden bridge still stood beside Samuel's journal. He ran a hand over the carved edges, feeling the texture of time, the weight of memories. He thought of the bridge as more than a symbol. It was a promise. A reminder that no matter how many storms came, the bridge would hold, as long as it was built on faith. The clock ticked softly in the background, and Ethan began sketching again, not for a client, not for an award, but for himself. Lines became shapes, shapes became dreams, and the rhythm of creation filled the room. As he drew, he realized how far he had come, not just in skill but in spirit. He no longer chased perfection. He embraced progress. He no longer feared failure. He respected it. He no longer measured success by applause, but by impact. When he finally set the pencil down, he looked at the new design, an open space filled with light, meant for children to learn, create, and dream freely. A place where no one would ever feel forgotten. He smiled, feeling a sense of completeness, not because his story was ending, but because it was still evolving. Every person he helped, every lesson he shared, was another bridge built, connecting his heart to the world. The city outside continued to hum, alive with stories and struggles of its own. Ethan watched the lights blink in the distance and whispered quietly to himself, "We all start somewhere, and we all rise, one failure at a time." And as the night deepened, the quiet hum of possibility lingered in the air, steady, eternal, and full of promise. The following morning arrived wrapped in pale gold, sunlight breaking through thin clouds and spilling softly across Ethan's desk. He stirred from his chair, where he had fallen asleep beside the unfinished sketches. The scent of paper, wood, and ink surrounded him, the familiar perfume of creation. As he looked around, he realized that this studio, once just a small rented room with second-hand furniture, had transformed into the heart of something much greater. Yet in its quiet corners, he could still feel the pulse of his earliest dreams. He stood and stretched, his gaze falling on the new drawing he had made the night before, a vision of a community learning center where children and adults could build, paint, and share their talents freely. The idea had come to him not as ambition, but as instinct, a whisper of purpose telling him this was the next step. He could almost hear Samuel's voice guiding him, reminding him that true architecture wasn't just about walls and beams, but about the souls that would live within them. As the day moved forward, Ethan called a meeting with his design team. The conference room was bright, filled with eager young faces, some of them students he had once mentored, now grown into confident architects themselves. "We're starting something new," Ethan announced, his voice steady but warm. "I want to create a place where creativity has no age, no status, no limitation. A space that reminds people they matter." The team exchanged excited glances, notebooks opening in unison. Questions, ideas, and possibilities began filling the air like sparks. One of them, a young woman named Layla, leaned forward. "Should we make it modern and bold, like your recent projects?" Ethan smiled slightly. "No. Let's make it honest. Let's make it feel like home." As discussions continued, sketches formed, and models took shape, Ethan felt something inside him awaken, a childlike joy he hadn't experienced in years. Each beam, each corner, each open window seemed to carry emotion. It wasn't just design. It was storytelling through space. Days turned into weeks, and soon the site for the new center was chosen, a quiet hill on the outskirts of the city, overlooking a river. When Ethan first stood on the land, the wind brushed against his face, bringing with it the smell of soil and grass. He closed his eyes, imagining what would one day rise here, laughter echoing through halls, footsteps of students chasing dreams, and light flooding through wide-open ceilings. Construction began slowly, but Ethan didn't rush it. He visited the site daily, often rolling up his sleeves to help the workers. He spoke to them not as a boss but as a friend, sharing stories, learning their names, asking about their families. One of the older builders once said, "Sir, I've worked for many men in my life, but never one who builds with his heart." Ethan only smiled. "That's because I learned from someone who built with his soul." Months passed, and the structure began to breathe. Glass walls caught the sunlight. Wooden beams stretched like arms reaching toward the sky. Every corner seemed to tell a story of resilience. When rain poured, it danced across the roof like a reminder of his first night of doubt. When the wind whistled through the unfinished halls, it sounded like Samuel's laughter. One afternoon, as Ethan reviewed the final interior designs, a letter arrived on his desk. The handwriting was careful, almost hesitant. It was from one of the children at the orphanage. "Dear Mr. Ethan, I came to visit the bridge last week. It's still standing. My teacher told me that you built it when you thought your life was falling apart. I don't know what it means to fail yet, but I know what it means to hope. Thank you for showing me that broken things can still be strong. I want to be an architect like you someday." Ethan read it twice, then folded the paper carefully and placed it inside Samuel's journal. The words stayed with him through the night, echoing in his heart. It struck him that the child who wrote that letter already understood something it had taken him years to learn. That pain, when embraced, can become the foundation of something beautiful. When the community center was finally complete, it was more than he had imagined. Children ran through its open halls, painters displayed their canvases on sunlit walls, and young musicians filled the air with melodies. Ethan watched it all quietly from a distance, hands in his pockets, the soft murmur of life rising around him. Reporters came, cameras flashed, and once again, people celebrated his name. But amidst the noise, Ethan's eyes were drawn to a small detail. Near the main entrance, one of the builders had carved something into the stone foundation. It read, "Built on failure, held by hope." He smiled. No words could have captured it better. As twilight descended, Ethan stayed behind after everyone had gone. The hallways glowed faintly in the fading light, and he could hear faint laughter in the distance. He sat down on a bench near the window, gazing out at the river. The current shimmered, moving endlessly, reflecting the city lights like scattered fire. For a moment, he imagined Samuel sitting beside him again, the same calm presence, the same wise silence. "You see," Ethan whispered, "it's all connected. Every fall, every doubt, every broken moment, it all led here." The air was still, but he could almost feel an answer, a quiet affirmation in his chest. The same pulse that had guided him through storms was still there, steady and unshakable. Over the next few months, the center became a beacon for dreamers. People from all walks of life came to learn, to build, to rediscover their forgotten hopes. Ethan often walked among them unnoticed, listening to their laughter and stories, content just to see them thrive. He knew he didn't need to be remembered for his name. He only wanted to be remembered for what he helped others see in themselves. One evening, a small exhibition was held inside the center. Paintings, sculptures, and photographs filled the hall. At the center of the room stood a wooden sculpture of a bridge, crafted by one of the children. A plaque beneath it read, "To the man who taught us that failure builds strength." Ethan stood before it for a long while, his eyes soft with emotion. He traced the edges of the bridge, feeling its imperfections, its uneven lines, and loved it all the more because of them. It was imperfect, yes, but alive. Just like his journey. And as the night deepened outside, the glow from the windows stretched across the river, reflecting a story that had begun long ago, with one man, one failure, and one unshakable belief that it was never too late to begin again. The room was quiet, filled only with the hum of distant conversation and the gentle strumming of a guitar somewhere outside. Ethan remained standing before the sculpture, lost in its simplicity. The bridge, though small, carried a certain weight. Each carved line told of struggle, patience, and belief. It reminded him of every sleepless night, every rejection, every time he had to convince himself to take one more step forward when the world told him to give up. He thought about how, once, failure had felt like an ending. But now, he realized, it had been the beginning of everything meaningful. Without those moments of despair, he would have never discovered the resilience hidden deep within him, nor the quiet voice that whispered to keep going even when no one else believed. The lights in the hall dimmed slightly as the event came to an end. One by one, people began to leave, their laughter fading into the cool night air. Ethan stayed, his eyes tracing the flickering shadows on the wall. The rhythm of the evening slowed, and for the first time in a long while, he felt peace. Not the fleeting kind that came with success, but the deep, grounded peace that grows from understanding who you truly are. He walked outside, the air crisp and carrying the scent of rain. The sky above was wide and silver with stars, stretching endlessly. As he looked up, he remembered the countless nights when he had stared at this same sky, wondering if his dreams were too big, too impossible. And now, standing there, he realized the universe had never been against him. It had been waiting for him to believe. Down the slope of the hill, a faint glow came from the riverbank where a few of the young artists were gathered around a small fire. They were laughing, sharing stories, sketching in the dirt with sticks. Ethan smiled and walked toward them. They greeted him warmly, offering him a seat by the flames. One of them, a teenage boy with ink-stained hands, looked at him curiously. "Sir," he said, "how did you keep going when everything went wrong? When everyone doubted you?" Ethan stared into the fire for a moment before answering. "Because I realized that failure doesn't mean you're finished," he said quietly. "It means you're learning something the easy path could never teach you. Every time I fell, I discovered a part of myself I didn't know existed. And once you've seen your own strength in the dark, no light can ever blind you again." The boy nodded thoughtfully, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Around the circle, the others listened in silence, their faces glowing with quiet admiration. In that moment, Ethan felt something shift, the realization that his journey had come full circle. The pain that had once broken him had become the very reason others were learning to rise. The fire crackled softly, sparks dancing upward into the night. Ethan leaned back, the warmth of the flames washing over him. "You see," he continued, "success is not about reaching the top. It's about refusing to stay down. It's about building bridges from your failures so that others can cross more easily than you did." A hush fell over the group. Even the river seemed to listen. Later that night, as the fire died down and the group dispersed, Ethan stayed behind for a while. The moonlight shimmered across the water, painting it silver. He thought of the letter from the orphanage, the laughter in the community center, the sculpture of the bridge, and he felt a deep gratitude. Every scar, every heartbreak, every lonely step had led him here, to this exact moment of quiet fulfillment. As he turned to leave, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an old contact at the architecture board. They wanted him to give a keynote speech at an upcoming international design conference, a recognition that, years ago, he could only have dreamed of. Ethan stared at the screen, smiling faintly. It was not the award or the applause that moved him. It was the chance to share what he had learned through the storms. When the day of the conference arrived, the hall was grand and filled with architects, artists, and students from around the world. Ethan stood on the stage, a single spotlight bathing him in warm light. For a moment he said nothing, letting the silence speak. Then, in a voice both steady and gentle, he began. "When I was younger, I believed success was a straight road, a climb, a race, a finish line. But I was wrong. Success is a maze of failures, doubts, and lessons. It is the art of falling and rising with more grace each time. And it begins the moment you stop seeing failure as your enemy." He paused, scanning the faces in the audience, some curious, some moved, some quietly nodding. "I once lost everything," he continued. "My projects, my reputation, even my will to try again. But what I didn't lose was the seed of hope that something greater could be built from the ruins. That seed became my foundation. You see, a building without cracks cannot let the light in, and a life without failure cannot let wisdom grow." The hall was silent. Not the empty kind of silence, but the kind that holds emotion, the kind that means people are listening with their hearts. Ethan looked down at his hands, then back up. "If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Failure is not a sign to stop, it's an invitation to evolve. Every time you break, you become capable of rebuilding yourself stronger, wiser, and more human than before." When he finished, the applause rose slowly but powerfully, spreading through the hall like a wave. People stood, clapping, some even wiping their eyes. Ethan bowed his head slightly, humbled, not by fame but by connection. He knew the words had not come from him, They had come through him, shaped by every hardship he had endured. After the conference, as he walked out into the evening air, the city lights shimmered in the distance. He felt light, free from the weight of proving himself. He no longer chased success. He embodied it in its truest form, the quiet strength to rise, to give, and to keep walking. And as he walked through the crowd, someone called out softly, "Mr. Ethan!" He turned and saw a young woman running toward him, holding a small notebook. "I just wanted to thank you," she said breathlessly. "I was about to quit architecture. But after hearing your story, I think I'll try again." Ethan smiled gently. "That's all I ever hoped for," he said. "That someone somewhere would decide not to give up." The woman smiled back, tears glinting in her eyes, and disappeared into the crowd. Ethan watched her go, a quiet pride filling his chest. He turned toward the horizon, where the last light of the day lingered. He knew now that success was never a destination. It was a journey that began anew every time someone dared to believe again. As the night deepened and the city lights flickered like a constellation of dreams, Ethan found himself walking along the quiet boulevard leading to the bridge he had once built, the very one that had marked his lowest and most defining moment. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of the river mixed with the memory of rain. Each step he took echoed softly against the pavement, a rhythm that matched the steady beating of his heart. When he reached the bridge, he stopped halfway and leaned on the railing. The water below shimmered faintly under the moonlight, just as it had years ago when he'd stood in this very spot, broken and uncertain. Only now, the reflection staring back at him was no longer of a man defeated, but of someone who had learned the quiet art of rebuilding. The night breeze whispered against his skin, almost as if carrying voices from the past. Samuel's calm encouragement, his mother's unwavering belief, the laughter of the children from the community center. Every sound reminded him that his story was not his alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever fallen and dared to rise again. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of gratitude settle over him like a warm cloak. The bridge had become more than just concrete and steel. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that beauty can grow from what once seemed like ruin. And perhaps that was the essence of life itself, to find strength in the very cracks that threatened to break you. A soft sound interrupted his thoughts, the quiet shuffle of footsteps approaching. When he turned, he saw a boy standing a few meters away, about 15, holding a sketchbook to his chest. He looked nervous, hesitant. "Are you Mr. Ethan?" the boy asked timidly. Ethan nodded with a gentle smile. "Yes, I am. What's your name?" "Adam," the boy replied, stepping closer. I saw your speech online. My teacher showed it to us. I wanted to see this bridge for myself." Ethan smiled. "It's a special place, isn't it?" The boy nodded. "I wanted to thank you. I was going to quit school last year. I thought I'd never be good enough for anything. But after hearing your story, I decided to keep going. I started drawing again. I want to be an architect one day, like you." Ethan felt something stir deeply within him, a familiar warmth that words could never fully describe. "That's wonderful, Adam. You know, this bridge was once my biggest failure. I thought it would destroy my career. But it became the beginning of everything." The boy looked surprised. "Really? It's perfect now." Ethan chuckled softly. "It wasn't always. It collapsed once. It took months of rebuilding, and I almost gave up. But sometimes the most beautiful things in life are born from what falls apart." The boy listened intently, his eyes shining with quiet admiration. "Do you think failure can really be good?" Ethan leaned on the railing beside him. "Failure is like fire. It can destroy you if you let it, but if you learn to use it, it can forge you into something stronger. Every time you fail, you're given a choice, to stop or to grow. Choose growth, and you'll never truly lose." Adam smiled faintly, clutching his sketchbook tighter. "I'll remember that." They stood there in silence for a while, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across the river. Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, a quiet satisfaction that went beyond success, beyond recognition. It was the peace of knowing that his pain had purpose, that the storms he had survived were now guiding someone else toward their dawn. When Adam finally left, Ethan lingered a little longer, his thoughts wandering through the corridors of time. He thought of the younger version of himself, the one who had stood on this bridge years ago, trembling with doubt. He wished he could reach back through time, place a hand on that man's shoulder, and tell him that every heartbreak, every sleepless night, every failure would someday make sense. That he was not breaking, he was becoming. The city clock struck midnight, and the sound drifted across the river like an echo of destiny. Ethan straightened up, taking one last look at the bridge before turning back toward the road. The path ahead glowed faintly under the streetlights, and he began to walk with quiet certainty. There were still dreams to build, still lives to touch, still lessons to live. As he walked past the park, he noticed an old oak tree standing tall and unmoving, its branches swaying gently. He remembered sitting beneath a tree just like it years ago, with Samuel sketching blueprints beside him. "You can't force greatness," Samuel had said then. "You build it piece by piece, failure by failure, until it becomes inevitable." The words echoed now like a heartbeat in his mind. He realized how right Samuel had been. True success wasn't an explosion, it was a steady flame, a light that burned quietly through persistence and purpose. When he reached home, Ethan stepped into his small study. The same sketches and journals still filled the shelves. But among them now were new photographs. Smiling faces of the children from the community center, workers from his projects, and young architects he had mentored. On the wall hung a single-framed quote that read, "Strength is built, not found." He sat by the window, looking out at the distant city lights. His phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Layla, his project manager. "We just got the approval for the next design, the center expansion. The board said your vision inspired them to fund it fully." Ethan smiled, typing back a short reply. "That's wonderful. Let's make it even better than before." He set the phone down and looked out again. The city was alive, breathing, filled with stories of its own. Somewhere, someone was just beginning their battle, doubting themselves, thinking it was over. He wished he could tell them that the pain they were feeling would one day be the reason they succeeded, that every great life was built on the courage to continue when it was hardest to do so. The clock ticked softly beside him. He picked up his pen, opened his old notebook, and began to write. Not plans this time, but thoughts, lessons, moments he didn't want to forget. He wrote about failure, about courage, about the quiet magic of persistence. And with every line, he felt a gentle peace bloom within him. He realized something profound then, that success was not about winning. It was about becoming. The journey, not the destination, was what made it all meaningful. Outside, the wind carried the scent of possibility. Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes soft, heart calm. The night stretched endlessly ahead, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't rushing toward tomorrow. He was simply here, grateful, alive, and ready for whatever came next. The next morning arrived with soft golden light spilling through the curtains, the kind that painted everything with quiet hope. Ethan stirred from his chair, realizing he had fallen asleep at his desk again, pen still resting loosely in his hand. The open notebook lay before him, its pages filled with reflections that read like pieces of his soul. His fears, his lessons, his victories written not in ink, but in truth. He stretched, feeling the ache of time in his shoulders, and smiled faintly. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the sound of distant traffic. It was an ordinary morning, yet something about it felt new, like the calm after years of unrelenting storms. As he sipped his coffee, he glanced at the photographs pinned on the wall. Each captured moment told a different story. A young student proudly presenting her first architectural model, a team laughing after completing a long project, children painting murals on the walls of the community center. All those faces reminded him why he had kept going when quitting seemed easier. They were the reason his failures had meaning. He walked to the window and looked out at the skyline. The city was alive, cranes moving, people rushing, sunlight glinting off glass towers. Somewhere among them were dreamers like him, people who had fallen but were learning to rise again. The thought filled him with a deep, unshakable sense of connection. A knock sounded at the door. When he opened it, he found Layla standing there, holding a rolled blueprint and smiling. "Morning," she said brightly. "I thought you'd want to see this before the meeting." Ethan stepped aside, gesturing her in. "You're early." "I couldn't wait," she said, spreading the blueprint across the table. "It's the final layout for the expansion, the learning wing, the art studio, and the new open courtyard. We've integrated your original sketches, but added a few modern touches." Ethan leaned over the plans, his eyes tracing the lines. He could see her touch in the design, clean, fluid, full of life. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "You've made it better than I imagined." Layla smiled. "You taught me how to build with emotion, not just precision. I wanted this to feel alive, like everything you've built." Her words warmed him more than she could know. There was something deeply fulfilling about watching others grow beyond you, seeing the seeds you planted blossom into forests of their own. As they talked, he noticed a small sketch tucked beneath the main plans, a rough pencil drawing of a bridge. "What's this?" he asked. Layla hesitated, then smiled shyly. "That's your bridge," she said softly. "The one that changed everything. I thought we should include its design as a symbol somewhere in the center. It started your journey. It should continue inspiring others." Ethan stared at it for a long moment. His throat tightened slightly. "You're right," he said quietly. "Let's put it at the entrance. Let everyone who walks in see where the story began." The rest of the day unfolded in a blur of meetings, site visits, and conversations. But beneath the busyness, Ethan carried a quiet sense of purpose that steadied him like a heartbeat. Wherever he went, he saw glimpses of himself in others, in the nervous intern afraid to make mistakes, in the construction worker wiping sweat from his brow but smiling with pride, in the students sketching wildly with hope in their eyes. Everywhere, he saw reflections of his own journey, proof that struggle was not an obstacle, but a thread woven through every meaningful life. By evening, he returned to the construction site. The sun was setting behind the half-built framework of the new wing, casting long shadows that made the steel beams glow like gold. Workers packed their tools, laughter echoing across the open space. Ethan walked through the structure, running his fingers along the cool metal. He could already imagine it completed, the laughter of children, the hum of creativity, the scent of paint and fresh ideas filling the air. He stopped at the center of the courtyard, where the foundation for the bridge sculpture was being prepared. Standing there, surrounded by dust and light, he felt something stir in his chest, a whisper of the same determination that had carried him through his darkest days. He whispered to himself, "This is what it means to fail forward." As twilight deepened, he sat on a nearby bench, watching the workers leave one by one. The city lights began to bloom in the distance, reflections dancing across the glass and steel. A gentle wind brushed his face, carrying with it the faint hum of life, of progress. His phone buzzed again, a message from Adam, the boy he had met at the bridge. "Mr. Ethan, I just got accepted into the architecture program. I wanted to tell you first. Thank you for believing that failure can be a beginning." Ethan's eyes softened. He typed back, "I'm proud of you, Adam. Remember, build with your heart, not just your hands." He set the phone down and sat quietly, smiling into the fading light. It amazed him how a few simple words, spoken in honesty, could ripple through time, touching lives he might never even meet. Later that night, as he walked home, he passed by a bookstore with its lights still on. In the window, a display caught his eye, a book titled The Art of Rising, Stories of Resilience and Hope. Curious, he stepped closer and saw his own name printed at the bottom as the author. He had almost forgotten about it. Months ago, a publisher had asked to compile his journal reflections into a book. He hadn't thought much of it since, assuming it would just quietly exist somewhere on a shelf. But seeing it there now, surrounded by other titles about dreams and perseverance, he felt an overwhelming sense of humility. He stepped inside, the smell of old pages and ink wrapping around him. A young cashier looked up and smiled. "You're Ethan Hayes, right? We just got your book today. People have already been asking about it." Ethan chuckled softly. "That's good to hear." He bought a copy, ran his fingers over the cover, and tucked it under his arm as he stepped back into the night. For a moment, he just stood there, feeling the cool air brush against his face. He wasn't thinking about awards or recognition. What moved him most was knowing that somewhere, someone might open that book on a difficult night, read his words, and find a reason not to give up. As he walked on, the city hummed around him. Cars passing, lights flickering, voices blending into a quiet symphony. He realized then that success wasn't the applause or the fame. It was the ability to leave something behind that helped others see light in their own darkness. He paused at a crosswalk, watching the signal change, and smiled to himself. The journey that had once felt impossible had become his greatest masterpiece, not the buildings he designed, but the lives he touched through them. And though he had walked a long, winding road, he knew deep down that this was only another beginning, another step on a path that would never truly end. The following weeks moved in a rhythm both calm and full of quiet wonder. Ethan began each morning with a sense of gratitude, not rushing through his days anymore, but savoring every detail. The soft hiss of the coffee machine, the rustle of blueprints on his desk, the laughter that filled the office when his team gathered to brainstorm. There was a gentleness in how he carried himself now, a patience born not from ease but from understanding. He had learned, through years of struggle, that everything meaningful grows slowly, brick by brick, moment by moment. He no longer chased perfection. Instead, he nurtured progress, the kind that takes root deep inside and blossoms quietly, unseen at first, but unstoppable once it begins. One afternoon, as he reviewed the construction progress of the new center, the foreman approached him. "Mr. Ethan," he said, "the sculpture base is ready. Would you like to see it before we pour the final layer?" Ethan nodded and followed him across the site. The sound of hammers and drills echoed faintly, mingling with the wind. When they reached the open courtyard, he stopped. Before him stood the foundation of the sculpture that would carry the small bridge design Layla had insisted on adding, a symbol of where everything had begun. He knelt beside it, brushing his hand across the surface. "Perfect," he whispered. "Just perfect." The foreman watched him curiously. "You've built many things, sir," he said. "But this one feels different." Ethan smiled, looking out at the unfinished structure. "That's because this one isn't built for recognition," he replied. "It's built for remembrance." He stayed there for a moment longer, letting the weight of those words settle. Then he stood, the wind catching his coat as he turned toward the sunset. Later that evening, after the site had emptied, he lingered behind, as he often did. The light softened, casting a golden hue over everything. Dust hung in the air like glitter, and the faint hum of the city became a distant lullaby. He took out his notebook and began sketching again, not for work, but for himself. The lines came easily now, flowing with confidence and calm. He was no longer designing structures for approval. He was designing memories, emotions, and the kind of spaces that could hold hope. While he drew, a faint sound reached his ears, the soft, hesitant notes of a violin. He looked up and saw a young woman standing near the scaffolding, playing quietly to herself. Her case was open on the ground, empty except for a few coins. She looked lost, fragile, the music trembling like her hands. Ethan rose and walked toward her. She stopped playing immediately, startled. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to disturb you. The echo here, it sounded beautiful." Ethan smiled kindly. "No need to apologize. Music belongs here." She looked around shyly. "I come here sometimes after my rehearsals. I'm not in the orchestra anymore. They said I wasn't good enough. But this place, it makes me feel like I still can be." Ethan studied her for a moment. "Do you know why I built this?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "For people like you," he said. "For anyone who has been told they aren't enough. This space is meant to remind you that you already are." Her eyes shimmered, tears threatening to fall. "I thought failure meant I should stop," she whispered. Ethan smiled softly. "Failure never means stop. It means start again, this time wiser." The girl looked at him, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no words came. She nodded instead, slowly, then picked up her violin. "May I?" she asked. "Please," Ethan said, stepping back. She lifted the bow and began to play again. The notes rose into the air, gentle at first, then strong, swelling through the unfinished courtyard. The music wrapped around the steel beams and open sky, filling the space with something ethereal, something alive. Ethan closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. It felt like every heartbeat, every fall, every triumph he had ever lived was being translated into sound. When she finished, there was silence, beautiful, heavy silence. "That," he said quietly, "is what success sounds like." She smiled, tears glistening on her cheeks, and whispered, "Thank you." As she left, the echoes of her violin lingered in the air long after she was gone. Ethan stood there beneath the rising moon, his heart full. He realized that the world was filled with people carrying broken dreams, waiting for someone, or something, to remind them that their stories weren't over yet. Maybe that was his true purpose now, not to build structures, but to build reminders of hope. The following days unfolded in a blur of purpose. The construction neared completion, and the anticipation in the air was almost electric. Volunteers arrived daily to paint, plant gardens, and assemble furniture. The laughter of children filled the once empty halls, mixing with the rhythmic sounds of progress. Ethan walked among them, smiling quietly, his presence calm but inspiring. One afternoon, he watched as a group of children dipped their brushes into buckets of bright paint, coloring the courtyard walls with murals of bridges, suns, and trees. Layla stood beside him, hands on her hips, watching the chaos with a grin. "They're making a mess," she said playfully. Ethan chuckled. "Sometimes that's how creation looks before it becomes beautiful." Layla glanced at him. "You really believe that, don't you?" He nodded. "I've lived it." That night, after everyone left, Ethan walked through the quiet halls again. The scent of fresh paint and wood lingered in the air. The walls glowed faintly beneath the dim lights, and the silence was peaceful, not the emptiness of before, but the calm of something ready to begin. He paused at the main entrance, where a plaque had just been mounted beside the doors. It read, "Dedicated to every dreamer who fell and rose again. May you always find light in the cracks." Ethan traced the words with his fingers, his heart swelling with emotion. He thought of Samuel, of his failures, of every night spent wondering if he would ever find his way. He wished Samuel could see this, could see what his faith had built. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and steady. Ethan stepped out into it, letting the cool water touch his skin. It reminded him of the night long ago when he had stood in the rain, believing everything was over. Now, standing here again, he realized how far he had come. He closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over him. It felt like a quiet baptism, a renewal. And as the storm gathered strength, Ethan smiled, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of falling anymore. He had learned the greatest truth of all, that every fall, no matter how deep, was just the beginning of another rise. The grand opening day arrived under a sky brushed with gold. The city that had once ignored Ethan's name now buzzed with anticipation. Crowds gathered outside the new community center, the structure that had once been nothing more than a desperate sketch in the corner of a tattered notebook. The building stood proud, modern yet warm, glass and steel balanced perfectly with the softness of green gardens and the calm of open courtyards. It reflected not only architectural mastery but the soul of a man who had rebuilt himself from ruins. As the ribbon fluttered in the morning breeze, Ethan stood before the crowd. Cameras flashed, children cheered, and somewhere in the sea of faces, he spotted Layla, smiling proudly. But his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from emotion. Because this was more than a building, it was his confession to life itself. When the applause settled, he took the microphone. His voice, deep and steady, echoed through the courtyard. "Years ago," he began, "I thought failure was the end of my story. I thought success was a destination. But I was wrong. Failure isn't the opposite of success, it's part of it. It's the raw material that shapes you, humbles you, and prepares you for what you were truly meant to do." He paused, looking around at the faces, students, parents, dreamers, and the broken souls who came seeking light. "This place," he continued, "was not built from wealth or fame. It was built from rejection, loss, and the quiet nights of doubt. Every crack, every scar in these walls represents the struggle we all face when the world tells us we're not enough." The audience was silent, drawn in by the weight of his words. But here's the truth, Ethan said, his tone deepening. Every time you fall, you have two choices: to stay down and let the world define you, or to rise again and define yourself. I chose the second. And today, I stand here not because I never failed, but because I never gave up. His eyes glistened as he looked up at the enormous steel arch above the entrance, shaped like an open bridge. This bridge, he said, pointing toward it, represents the journey we all must take, from fear to courage, from doubt to belief, from failure to purpose. And every person who walks through these doors will walk that bridge, not just with their feet, but with their hearts. Then, turning toward the plaque by the entrance, he gently placed his hand on it. This, he whispered, is not just my story. It's yours. It's every dreamer's story who fell, broke, and rose again. The crowd erupted in applause, but Ethan barely heard it. For him, this wasn't about recognition. It was about release. Every burden, every sleepless night, every voice that once said he couldn't, melted into that moment. He felt light, free, alive. As the ceremony ended, children rushed into the courtyard, their laughter ringing through the halls. The young violinist from before stood near the garden, playing her melody again, this time, with confidence, her music filling every corner of the new center. The sound wrapped around the space like sunlight, pure and full of hope. Ethan closed his eyes and listened. Layla walked up beside him, smiling softly. "You did it," she said. He shook his head. "We did it. Everyone who ever believed when it didn't make sense, this belongs to them too." She looked at him thoughtfully. "So what's next?" Ethan smiled, gazing at the sky. "Next, I'll keep building. Not just buildings, dreams, courage, people. Because success isn't what you have, it's what you give back." Layla nodded, emotion glistening in her eyes. "You know," she said, "I think Samuel would be proud." Ethan's throat tightened. He turned toward the horizon where the sun dipped slowly, painting the sky in amber light. "I hope so," he murmured. "Because everything he taught me is here, in these walls, in their laughter, in every dream that dares to begin again." That evening, as the crowd dispersed and the sun sank below the skyline, Ethan remained. The lights of the building glowed gently, reflecting off the glass like stars trapped in a dream. The air smelled of rain and fresh beginnings. He walked through the quiet courtyard, past the murals painted by the children, each one a burst of color and hope. He stopped before the central fountain, watching the water ripple under the soft moonlight. He could almost hear Samuel's voice, calm and wise as ever. "Greatness doesn't come from never falling, Ethan. It comes from rising every time you do." He smiled faintly, whispering, "You were right, old friend." As the night deepened, a gentle wind swept across the courtyard, carrying the faint echo of the violin through the open halls. The bridge sculpture gleamed beneath the moon, a silent promise that no one who entered this place would ever walk alone in their pain again. Ethan stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, eyes reflecting the stars. Everything he had lost once seemed like an ending. Now he understood. It was never an ending. It was the beginning of becoming who he was meant to be. Because success, he realized, was not about arriving, it was about evolving. It wasn't about applause, but about impact. It wasn't about wealth, but worth. And the true worth of a life wasn't measured by how high you climbed, but by how many others you helped rise along the way. As he finally turned to leave, the automatic lights dimmed behind him, one by one, until only the bridge remained illuminated, a beacon in the dark. The soft rain began to fall again, whispering against the pavement. Ethan tilted his face toward the sky, letting the raindrops touch his skin like blessings from every failure he had ever faced. He smiled, a quiet, peaceful smile that carried the weight of every storm he had survived. And in that moment, the man who had once been broken by failure walked away not as a survivor, but as a creator of hope. His story had come full circle, from darkness to dawn, from despair to destiny, proving once and for all that no fall is final, unless you choose not to rise.